Perpich's administration from 1983 until 1991. She is co-founder of the Minnesota chapter of the National Association of Women Business Owners and the Minnesota Women's Campaign Fund, and was executive director and CEO of NAFSA's Association of International Educators for nearly 2 decades. She is now on the advisory board of Kenya's Dream, a board member of the Washington Office on Latin America, and a trustee of the Alexandria Trust in 1988. She was awarded the Royal Order of the Polar Star by the Kingdom of Sweden. She is joined today by Jenna Holland Shelton, who is a former national reporter for the Associated Press, where she has covered the U.S. Supreme Court for 5 years during her 17-year career. Jenna joined the University of Arkansas in 2013 and has taught courses in media law, government and media, news reporting, and editing. Shelton serves as the campus advisor to the Society of Professional Journalists and is president of the Northwest Arkansas Professional SPJ chapter. Earlier this year, she was named interim director of the U of A Center of Media Ethics and Literacy. So welcome, Marlene and Jenna.
Thank you.
Is this on? Is this on? Okay.
Is mine on? Yes.
Excellent.
Can y'all hear me? Okay, they are on? Okay.
They're on?
Okay,
Are we,
great.
Everything's good. Okay.
Thank you so much to the Fayetteville Public Library for hosting this event, and thank you for coming to see us from Washington, D.C.
Well, this is a treat. I'm in awe of what you and Dee Dee Long can accomplish, so I'm happy to be here.
Well, I want to start with your childhood, your upbringing in a small town. It sounds very similar to Arkansas and some of the childhoods that many in this audience have had.
My birth town was Braham, Minnesota, a town when I lived there of 7,200 people. Today there's 1,200 people there, but a smaller economic base because it's become sort of a commuter town to the northern suburbs of Minneapolis. It's from the center of Minneapolis to my town, Braham, is about an hour. And so when I lived there, it was a very cordial community. Neighbors looked out for each other. I share in the book that misbehaving in the neighborhood was really not an option because Mrs. Stenstrom had my parents' full support, and if she said you shouldn't be doing something, they would take her word for it, not mine. If we did a buggy parade or if we sold lemonade outside on the street corner, there were plenty of people who would come by and cheer on the buggies or buy lemonade because everybody was raising everybody. And 4-H was our main organization, the place where I learned my first leadership skills and presenting demonstrations on how to do things, and whether it was doing a small electrical project or sewing a dress or baking bread or all the things that we were learning in 4-H. So it was a very nice community. The school was small. There were 60 people in my graduating class. So in order to have a photo club and in order to have all these other clubs, everybody had to participate in more than one thing. So I did. I was in the band and the choir and the photo club, and there's just lots of energy going on all the time, and lots of it was a very happy childhood.
And your dad served as mayor, is that
He
right?
did. He was. That was not a full-time job. That paid $200 a year. But it was. He was the mayor that at the time when Braham got its first police chief. So I still remember the first police chief. He took a coffee break every night at 8 o'clock and stopped by our house to check in with the mayor, and so we got to know Leroy Pearson very well. And my dad's work was as the founder of the first electric cooperative in Minnesota, the organization that brought electricity to rural America. And so my parents' wedding day on the farm where my mom grew up was the same day they turned the electricity on that farm. And so those were the kind of stories we grew up with, and we had a very strong connection to the farming community and the people who were members of the electric co-op.
In the book, you write about mentorship and having a mentor and
Yes.
being a mentor.
Yeah, I think the two stories in the book that are perhaps most memorable are from my college years. That really, both for me personally, were very powerful experiences. And as a result, they reminded me at every step in my adult life why it was important for me to engage with interns and when I was at NAFSA to make sure that we had a good intern program. I was at Macalester College in St. Paul at the time, and internships were quite new, and we had to figure them out ourselves, and I don't remember how I did that part. I do remember the two internships that were so important to me, and one of them, my mentor was a woman named Paralee Milligan, an African-American woman who was the director of the employment program at the Ramsey County Citizens Committee for Economic Opportunity. It was the St. Paul, the county's project or program that was part of the Lyndon Johnson War on Poverty. Everybody will remember that, who's my age or older. And Mrs. Milligan was a college-educated woman. At the time that I knew her, she was probably in her 50s. Not sure about that, but around early 50s, I would say. She had never had a professional job before because no one would hire African-American women with a college education. So she worked, up until that point, she worked her whole life in a factory. And at that time, factory work was piecework. So you got paid by the number of pieces that you did every day. And in her case, because she was so well educated and conceptually very strong, she could produce twice as much as anybody else on the floor. But she couldn't really do that because it was too harmful to the other workers, and her supervisors didn't trust her that she was actually doing the work. So she would take long breaks when, just so she'd slow down her work in order to be able to work at the pace she wanted when she was working. And as a result, she had an understanding of human nature and work environments, and she had very strong views on treating people with respect. And so, she talked to me about those issues all the time. My job was to identify people at corporations who she was going to work with to try to open up opportunities for African Americans in jobs that they had not had access to previously. So it was just an extraordinary experience for me, and I stayed in contact with her for many years after that. And I just, she was in my head, still is in my head, as you can see, on many levels. And and another person was, another internship was similarly related. But my point is, for me, that those were just transformative experiences. And I, as the CEO of NAFSA, which was when I had the most opportunity for creating internships, it was very important to me that we had intern programs that were really thoughtfully designed. I was determined to have internship programs that paid interns. We'd never had those when I was growing up, but it became clear to me when I was running NAFSA that if we didn't have paid internships, only privileged students would be able to be working with us. So we did that. We budgeted. I told everybody we can't have an internship program unless you figure out how to include the cost of it in your programs. And of course, it's like anything else in leadership. If it's part of the program, we do figure out how to make it work. We just have to have the commitment for it and the willingness to do the work of the nudges that are required. So it was, it's been great for me. And as I've mentored other people over the years, it's helped me encourage them to think about what the internship programs have been and what about mentoring has worked for them and what hasn't worked for them, so that they can mentor forward as well.
So after college, you went into business.
I did.
And I'd love to hear the challenges that you faced as a woman, as a single woman at that.
I think I think I think I started a business because I really couldn't figure out where I was going to work that would be interesting. And so I did have a summer job working for the YMCA. I was the first female program director that they'd ever hired, and I was having a great time. But the program I was running, did not have anybody promoting it, and it was a new kind of thing, and we needed a promotion. And so the Y hired a freelance writer to help produce some stuff. And she and I started talking and thought, it's ridiculous that people in running a program have to also promote the program, because those are two different skill sets. And if you're busy running a program, it's a diversion to promote it. And you know what I mean. So she and I started talking, and by the end of the summer, we said, why don't we figure out how to run a little business, and we'll focus on nonprofit organizations as our clients. And so we did. We pooled our money. We each had $200 in the bank. Ay, ay, ay. It's the truth, though. And we worked out of her basement. I was single, but she had a husband and a house that had a basement. They rented the house, but it had a basement and we got 2 file cabinets and put a door across them. Some of you who are old enough to remember that you did that in college. And we had bookshelves with bricks and boards. It was very basic. And a rebuilt Selectric typewriter. And I know that the college students in this room do not know what a Selectric typewriter is. And you can go to the museum and see them. It was pretty exciting, though, because they had automatic erasures in them. So we started working, and I tell the story in the book about how we got our first piece of business. The name of the company was Split Infinitive. If there's anybody who still is at all interested in grammar, you will know that the split infinitive is incorrect grammar. Journalists would definitely know this. And so we thought that would be a way for people to get at least curious about this business. So we wrote a letter to Robert T. Smith, who was a columnist for the Minneapolis Tribune. He was one of those guys who wrote a column, I don't know, twice a week or something. And we wrote him a letter that said, we are a new business started by 2 young women, and we are going to celebrate Shirley Chisholm's birthday and Eleanor Roosevelt's birthday rather than Abraham Lincoln and George Washington's birthday. And we are, we're not going to buy 2 martini lunches for people. And, it was kind of this flippant kind of letter about who we were, and sent it off to him. And within minutes of reading this letter, he called us and invited himself to come and talk to us. And then he wrote a column about us. And from that column, we got our first piece of business. And more business, but we got a piece of business literally that day. And so I tell the story of that story. And we did that. My partner stayed with the business for 3 years and then decided to relocate to California. And I kept the business going until I ran for lieutenant governor in 1990. I'm sorry, 1982. God.
At the time, though, some of the clubs where business was done were all male.
Yes. Yes, the St. Paul Athletic Club. I mean, at that time, probably here also, there were many of the cities in America had clubs, athletic clubs that often were called, but they had restaurants in them, and they were male only. Mostly, they were also white male only, including in St. Paul, the St. Paul Athletic Club. And in 1980 or something, St. Paul had integrated by race the athletic club, because the Urban League was now led by an African-American man, and that the person in that position had always been a member of the athletic club. So it was just too even they couldn't, they recognized they had to do something. So he had been invited to join, but there still were not women. So, but the athletic club had always sent complimentary memberships. I just love this. So they had always sent complimentary memberships to the new legislators every year. And without thinking, they just sent them off. Welcome, return this and you'll get a comp membership to use during the session, because the legislature is part-time, so they're just there from January to March or April or something like that. Anyway, this year in 1983, there were 6 new women elected. But nobody thought about that when they sent out the letters. And so one of the members was Linda Berglund, who used to be a graphic designer for my little business, and she was now a state representative. So she's a very quiet person. I mean, if you met her, she doesn't look like a politician. She seems like a very quiet introvert. Well, she is one. And so she called up Marianne Grossman, one of your colleagues, a journalist from the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and told her what her plan was. But she asked Marianne if she wanted to be there, that'd be great, but to not tell anybody in advance. So Linda just showed up at this, this cafeteria restaurant on the second floor. And the special thing about this restaurant in the club, they had 3 restaurants. The other 2 restaurants, the members could bring spouses or women guests to them. But this cafeteria restaurant, which was only open Monday through Friday for the working guys, women were not allowed there. You couldn't bring a female guest there, not even your spouse. So, but Linda had this invitation to be a member, so she just showed up. And the women behind the counter would not serve her, because of course they wanted to keep their jobs. I mean, it wasn't their fault. But there's Linda. But there's Marianne watching this. So Linda stood around long enough for Marianne to take a photograph and get the story. And the next day in the St. Paul Pioneer Press, that story appeared. And so, of course, the membership committee had been discussing this issue for a while, and there were men in the organization who wanted to include women. They just hadn't had enough votes yet. So they quickly called a meeting and said this is an opportunity, and they got, clearly they had to change their plan, and within a week they had admitted women. They allowed women to join. So then I and the other little entrepreneurs around town who couldn't afford membership, the thought of paying for a membership in the athletic club for me at that time was enough to make me sick to my stomach, because I had no money. But we had to, because they had made it possible, and Linda had she hadn't discussed it with me, even though she knew me. So we organized about 10 women to join right away to make sure that they felt good about their decision. And it turned out to be a very useful thing for me, and I was welcomed in the club, and it's a very helpful thing for my business as well as personally.
So when you decided to run for office, you had a lot of coalitions helping you. You had, built this career in business. Was there some criticism, because Minnesota had not had a female lieutenant governor before?
Well, actually, there had been very few women lieutenant governors anywhere in the country at that point. Some of you will remember Martha Lane Collins from Kentucky, who was lieutenant governor and ultimately became governor of Kentucky. She was one of maybe 3 or 4 lieutenant governors at the time. In Minnesota, we had never had one, and that summer earlier, we ran in 1982. Earlier in 82, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party at their conventions had actively discussed having a woman running mate for the candidate for governor. The Republican candidate, proposed candidate, woman candidate, was Senator Nancy Bradis, who was a very successful businesswoman in Rochester, Minnesota. She was a political consultant. She was terrific. On any measure, she would have been a fantastic candidate. And she was a state senator. She had been a state senator for 1 term, I think. But the party just couldn't, they just couldn't. I mean, and it was a public discussion. It was embarrassing to many people, and the women in the Republican Party were furious. So there was that angst. And then 2 weeks later, the Democratic Party had the same conversation at their convention, and the Democrats' candidate was Warren Spanis, who was already the Attorney General, and he was personally unable to handle having a woman running mate. I knew Warren very well, adored him. He gave me a job when I was in college, but this was way more than he could handle. So the Democratic Party had a woman Secretary of State who would have been a fabulous candidate. She was a very popular statewide candidate. She already won statewide, so it would have been terrific. But he said, no way. So former Governor Perpich decided that his competitive advantage in running in the primary against the party's candidate was to have a female running mate. So, I was the recipient of very good luck and timing. This is an example of you can't make it up, because it happens, and you can't plan it this way. It happens because other organizations, in this case the two parties, made a terrible strategic mistake. And so it benefited the opportunity that I had, and so we won by 23,000 votes, outspent 10-1. And so whenever they said, what did you contribute, I would say 23,000 votes. Didn't have to do much more than that.
So after you were elected, I loved reading about how you got very involved in issues, including children's issues. And you also made a new policy of publishing your schedule.
Yes.
You had a public schedule, which was very transparent, so that everyone could see what you were doing. And
yes, well, there were a couple of things that were special for me and for the role I had. The first one was that Governor Perpich had been lieutenant governor in the past and moved up to become governor when the then governor, Wendell Anderson, appointed himself to succeed Walter Mondale when Mondale became vice president. So, and at that time, when Perpich was lieutenant governor, he had no role at all in the administration. In fact, he never had a private conversation with the governor. And he wanted his relationship with his lieutenant governor to be just the opposite. So that was the first thing. The second thing was he wanted to get work, real strategic, important policy work out of his lieutenant governor. He wanted the lieutenant governor to be a partner in the administration and really contribute actively. And he wanted the administration to do some breakthrough things. He wanted more women and people of color to be appointed to boards and commissions, and he wanted the lieutenant governor to help him accomplish that. So he talked about those kinds of goals from the beginning. So I had that shall you say, endorsement. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but you understand what I'm saying. I had that strength that I could build on, and he already announced that he wanted me to head the tourism program and the Open Appointments Commission. So those were two that he decided, and then later, as I write about in the book, I made the decision, with the help of encouragement of others, to work on a children's agenda for the state. And before I committed to that, I asked the governor for his support so I could do that on behalf of the administration, and he concurred, and so I became the spokesperson for the administration as well as the designer of the children's agenda during those years. So it was a very exciting time because to your question about publishing the schedule, it was important to publish the schedule, but it was particularly important because I was publishing things that demonstrated what I was contributing to the administration. My meetings, the things we were publishing had to do with, in most cases, things that directly related to the open appointments process, the tourism agenda, sort of demonstrating how we were building a tourism strategy that strengthened the Minnesota economy, and then the children's agenda later on. So, yeah, it was very exciting.
Did you get much journalism attention? Were there reporters who were following you around?
Not much at all. In fact, I got more attention from national journalists than I did from local journalists. And on the children's agenda, I got national attention from Carl Rowan. Some of you will remember Carl as the first African-American columnist for the Washington Post, and from a Chicago Tribune journalist whose name just left my brain. So I apologize for that to him and to you. But anyway, he got interested and came up and interviewed me and did a lot of stories covering the children's agenda, because it was really, while the Clintons were doing some things on the children's agenda here in Arkansas at the same time, we were serving at the same period, so we had some shared experiences. A lot of what we were doing was quite special in the country. Yeah, I had something else you asked me to. What did I miss?
That's okay. I was just curious if journalists did a good job.
Oh,
Yeah.
I wanted to tell you one story. So that's right. Thank you. The most important journalist to me from the Minneapolis Tribune is a woman named Lori Sturdivant. She covered government during those times, and she's still writing a column in her retirement. And she did Jenna's role in my launch event in Minneapolis a month and a half ago. So she was really excited about the book, and I was pleased, because I was afraid that, I said to her, I was afraid there weren't enough political stories for you political junkies in the story. And she said to me, well, the truth is, there's not one political story you write in that book that I knew. And I said, well, what does that tell you, Lori? And she said, we didn't cover you. So it was fun. Yeah.
I want to switch gears and talk about Peter.
Yeah.
For those who haven't read the book yet, can you talk a little bit about how he came into your life and about his accident?
Peter's my husband, Peter Frankel. I met him in my lieutenant governor's office, minding my own business, planning to do other things that day, when the governor's office called and asked me to meet with this group of 3 Swedes who were in town to deliver a letter from the governor of the Kronoberg region of Sweden. So I did, and Peter was an auxiliary member of this team. The main character was a client of his, a banker from that town, and Peter and John Anderson were running around the country, traveling around the U.S. looking for opportunities. But in the course of doing that, they were made a stop in Minnesota to deliver this letter to the governor from the governor of that region. So that's how I met Peter, and they spent the weekend in town, and I arranged a few things. I write about that, and a few months later, we were trying to figure out how to establish a relationship by writing daily letters and having weekly telephone calls. And a few years later, we were committed to this within 6 months, and then a few years later we were married, and we maintained a transatlantic marriage our whole life. And in 2010, when I was in the second half of my time at NAFSA, we were finishing our summer holiday in Sweden, and during the night, Peter fell down a flight of stairs and suffered a serious brain injury that required living in a nursing home the rest of his life. So I write about that journey and what I learned being a spouse in a different culture, in a caregiving role, even though I wasn't caregiving at home because he had to be and I was still working. So I was going back and forth to Sweden every month for 10 days, and I was doing remote work as an executive before we had that remote work concept. It was pre-COVID. So it was a very special time for me in terms of, what I learned about leadership and what I learned about caregiving, and it was a very important experience for me.
So I got emotional reading about how, at the time, your mom's health was failing a little bit, and you were
Right.
calling her every day to check in on her.
Yes.
And then you had a team. You were the leader of 100 people
Right.
in your organization, and then you had a husband who
Yes.
couldn't really communicate with you.
It was one of the most important. I share this in the book. When Peter was first in the hospital, it happened in August, and so I had the day after it happened. I was supposed to be flying back to Washington after our summer holiday of 4 weeks, and so I didn't do that, of course. And he was in a coma for 3 weeks, so that was a lot of uncertainty. And then he was awake, and he was in the hospital for a few months, and I was trying to figure out what to do, and I was learning. I said to the physical therapist who was in the hospital, who was with him, doing his work with him every day, I said, of all the things, Peter and I have been in this transatlantic marriage for all this time, and we've done a lot of conversations and thinking about how we will handle certain things in a transatlantic way. How will all these things work? But this is one situation we had never anticipated. And she said to me, there is no one on this ward, in the neurological ward of Lund University Hospital, that has anticipated being here. And that's a really good thing, because if any of us anticipated the worst that could happen, we would not be able to get up in the morning. These things, she said, when they happen, whoever they happen to rises to the moment. And then that's when you find out how to do things, what you're capable of, and you find strength you didn't know you had. But you couldn't have anticipated this, so you shouldn't ever beat yourself up about that, because this is not the kind of thing you can do long-range planning about. And it was such a gift that she gave me, and I've thought about it a lot, and I've shared it a lot.
Well, I have other questions, but I feel like we might have some audience questions as well. So I don't know if it's time to take a break and let some folks ask some questions. So you've been in Washington, D.C. a long time.
I have.
So
yes.
I feel like you can speak a little bit to both the politics in Washington and the work that you've done that has brought you to the University of Arkansas and your ties here.
Well, I think, I'm here today because of Dee Dee Long. And Dee Dee Long is, for me, the metaphor for everything good that happened to me while I was at NAFSA. It was just one of those, we've all had them, I hope. I hope that we've all had them, that there are some things in life that happen that are just perfect for me. It was perfect for me, and I think that I was perfect for NAFSA. I think the timing was really, really good. And I am so blessed that happened, because together we could do lots of things, and I learned a lot. I feel really good about what I contributed to the organization, and I met all these amazing people like Dee Dee and hundreds of people who are so passionate about their work, and who have a personal vision for a community and a life and experiences for young people and for the community that really have an impact so far beyond their own life, that it was just one of those things that I just enjoyed all the time. And yeah, what can I say? Got lucky. I'm really a lucky person.
Okay, well, I'm going to let Dee Dee or do you want to do questions and have the mic? Yes? Okay. Okay. You guys might be shy.
Mentioned that you had worked with a gentleman, Raymond Strother, on your election.
Is this your husband? Oh, yeah.
Never mind.
No.
I worked with Ray Struther, and
I just love
he
that
had
man.
a history of electing first female candidates to a number of offices, including you, including Martha Lane Collins, who you mentioned, Blanche Lincoln here in Arkansas.
I forgot about her. That's
Yeah,
right.
and Lieutenant Governor of Mississippi, and just a number of other people. I was wondering if you could talk about the challenges, the different challenges of being a female candidate as compared to a male candidate, and how sometimes that could be harder, and what some of the advantages are, but as much as anything else, the unique challenges of being a first-time female candidate for an executive office.
Thank you. Well, first, I just have to say something about Ray Strother. I just love this man. I'm so happy that you got to work with him for a long time. He isn't with us anymore, but he was just a very, very special person to me and to many people. So I'm grateful for that experience. His name is in my book, and I'm sorry that he didn't live to know that. Anyway, I think when I ran in the first time in '82, I was 37 years old. So some of it was my youth, although 37-year-old men were never considered young. I mean, wouldn't have been a surprise to have a 37-year-old man running. And I had a message this morning from a former employee when I was lieutenant governor, who said she just finished reading the book, and she said, I just remembered something you said after we lost that last election. You said, if I was a man, there would be several corporate executives in town lining up to offer me a job. And in fact, I was lucky if I could get an appointment with any of them, and none of them saw my leadership skills at all, even the ones who I had worked with personally on everything and had been very supportive of the children's agenda. So I think it was really hard at the beginning for people to really get their heads around the fact that we could do things. And I think the Republican Party at that time, and I talked about this before I ran for office actually, when I was still involved in the Bipartisan Women's Political Caucus, I think the Republican Party in Minnesota was better initially at recruiting women candidates for swing districts because they saw the competitive advantage of it. They knew at that moment in time, it's not true right now, as we saw in the election this week, but at that time, women would cross party lines to support women because they were just so fed up. So when Republicans recruited women for swing districts, they were successful. And Democrats had a really hard time doing that because Democrats in swing districts had always had a long list of men who wanted those jobs. So they just couldn't share at all. And even in my own district, when I supported a woman candidate for the party endorsement, a person I supported because she had personally mentored me a lot. And when anybody who knew me knew that I would have to support Diane Ahrens because, just basic loyalty. And she lost, and another person won who was a man. He never forgave me. I mean, never. When I left Minnesota, he was still upset with me, 20 years later. He couldn't get it out of his head that I was disloyal to him, even though he won the election, and, when you win, you should be gracious. So I think there was just a lot of that at the time. And during the time I was lieutenant governor, it was very common that legislative leaders would say really stupid things to me in meetings. Really, I wouldn't repeat them because it's just too, but really the kind of things that were intended to what's the right word? Change the subject or get you off your game or something, and so there was one guy that was doing it all the time. He was a legislative leader. I knew him well, but he just couldn't stop himself, he just couldn't stop himself. So I decided that I was going to come up with something. So the next day, the next time I was in a meeting with him, before the meeting got started, I just went up to him and put my hand on his tie and then touched his chin as I would. And I said, "That's a really good-looking tie." Because he would always comment on my clothes. Always. Just as a, and after I did that, he never again interrupted a conversation with a comment about my clothes. I mean, it was the first time I got to him. I mean, I would never fight with him in public. I would never do that. But I had to stop him some way, and I couldn't. It took me a while to figure out what I could do that maybe most people didn't even notice. I don't think the governor noticed. I don't. The governor noticed what he did to me, but I don't think the governor noticed when I did that little moment of. But with him, it worked. So those are the kind of things that were just tedious. Yeah.
You did. Thank you for everything that you've shared. It's just an amazing life story that you have. But you did touch on the difference of the time that you've been in all of these roles and sort of where we are now, and seeing the younger women who are here today and having had a lot of similar experiences as the one you just described in my career. And also just sensing, the rollback of diversity, equity, this lashback, pushback, whatever is going on. And you're spending time in Washington and with other politicians, presumably. What's your sense of what younger women should be thinking about now, looking forward in their careers? What are the main skills that you know from leadership and your experience that they should focus on to face up to this? Because it's very blatant. So
Yeah, it's a difficult time, I think, but there are some. I mean, we are in a very different place, and one of the things that's true, I think, is that even though it's sort of hard when you're my age to appreciate that young women really can't imagine how it was for us in our 20s and 30s. The good side about that is that I think women come with a base of personal strength and confidence that I did not have at their age. So that is really good and really important, and I think will bode well for them. The other thing is that what I do write about in the book, and what I learned in writing the book, it became clearer to me in writing the book, is that leadership comes from many places. Certainly when I was the CEO of NAFSA, I was in a leadership role. When I was lieutenant governor, I had a job that had absolutely no power or authority, but I had many opportunities for influence. And so that was a different kind of leadership. It was leading many times when nobody noticed. Some people did because they came along with me, but it wasn't the kind of leadership that Laurie Sturdivant, the reporter, was noticing. But it doesn't always have to be, there. And then when I was overseeing the caregiving of my husband when he was in a nursing home, my leadership was totally different. It was totally behind the scenes and totally trying to help the staff, ensure that the staff and the nursing home saw Peter for who he had been. And so even though he couldn't speak for himself and he couldn't walk, he was totally dependent on other people. He could have opinions, but you had to ask him. So I had to work with the staff to motivate them to look out for those, or to remember to ask him when I wasn't there, because I was only with him 1 week a month, because I was going back and forth. And so at some point I went, oh, that's a really important leadership role I was playing. But nobody noticed it but me. And probably Peter did, but he didn't even know if you know what I mean? So it sort of reminded me that for all of us who are working with young people or with others, period, we just have to remember that leadership comes from every spot we're in. And that's one of the most important ways we're going to get through a harder, more challenging time like we're in right now.
I didn't think I was going to ask a question, but I changed my mind. Simply because I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with Marlene in the last couple of days. So we talked a lot about the book and everything. But one of the things that has struck me about your life is that, and that you shared this weekend with Bo and I, is that when you were in Washington, when Peter and you were in Washington, it was kind of your world and you were showing Peter. And when you went to Sweden, it was Peter's world, and he developed the social life and showed you Sweden.
Right.
But when he had his accident, all of a sudden, I think you were faced with knowing Sweden in a way you had never known it before,
Exactly.
and embracing it as yours instead of his. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that was like and what it's meant for you for now and for the future.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the first part, when we were married, and it was really important to both of us that the other person learn our culture and become friends with our friends, and then we would make friends together. But so that when he was in Minnesota or Washington, I would be in charge of our social life. So I'd sort of make sure we'd meet all the friends that I wanted him to meet, and we'd start making some new friends, and he'd do the same in Sweden. At the time of the accident, I had never spent a night alone in Sweden without him. I mean, it's bizarre when you think about it, because I lived alone so much, both because I was married late, but also then when I was with him, I was still alone a lot. But I'd never slept a night in Sweden without him, and I had used the Swedish healthcare system before, because I'd had a skiing accident, so I went to Sweden first before I went back to the U.S. So I had personal exposure to the Sweden healthcare system, but Peter had taken me there. He had coached his way, so I had never had to go to a doctor by myself or any of nothing. I couldn't even find my way to the the suburbs of Lund by myself, because I didn't do that kind of driving. I did a little bit of driving in the country by myself, but so it was new, and then so that was the first thing, and then I had to learn how to be an advocate for Peter in a system that was his. And I was learning about the healthcare system in Sweden, and the caregiving system, and then the nursing home system. So it was, the good news was that I was keeping a journal. One of the things that you'll learn in the book is that I have kept a journal since 1970, and during the years of after Peter's accident, I kept a journal very detailed all the time, just to make sure that I didn't lose the details that the doctors were sharing with me, or helping me understand the questions I wanted to ask of the system or things. So I was really facing questions that I didn't understand. Not so much, in some cases his care, but also just how things worked. I mean, one of the things, for instance, that happened to me was that when the chief of neurology told me that Peter would not ever go home, that he would be living in a nursing home for the rest of his life, that conversation took place in a small private room at the hospital with a social worker, the head nurse, and the head of physical therapy, all of whom I knew well by this time because we'd been living in the hospital for 2 months. And after he told me this, with tears in his eyes, one of the head nurse said, later today, there will be a case manager contacting you from the community, and she will be the person responsible for helping you find a nursing home that suits you and Peter. And I said, well, should I call her? And she said, no, you don't have to. She'll find you. And lo and behold, 3 hours later, this woman shows up in my face, physically talks to me, and sort of begins the process. And from that moment on, for the next 9.5 years, there was a person, a case manager, who was available to me and always was anticipating what decisions I needed to make and helping me learn how to do them. And so that was pretty special.
Okay, do we have any other? Oh, yes.
Marlene, one of the gems you left behind at NAFSA is the need for advocacy, and then
Yes.
specifically for international education. Can you share with this group what role advocacy plays, even at the local level as well as national, and how important it is even during this time?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think the issue of advocacy was one of the factors in NAFSA's decision to hire me and my interest in the organization, because I really like thinking about and articulating the purpose of doing something. My first advocacy experience, a successful experience I read about in the book, was when I learned that in order to apply to Macalester College, I needed 2 years of high school foreign language, and my high school didn't have it. So my parents said, well, why don't you advocate to the school board for adding a foreign language? So I did, and they did, and we did, and so I was able to apply to Macalester, and that was my first experience. So when I went to NAFSA, the board had decided, recognized that they needed to move beyond simply advocating, doing a government relations report, sort of learning more about visas and stuff like that, but we needed to articulate the value of international education for society, for the students, but also for the society writ large. And I just found that extremely exciting because it was a big picture. It was helping think about our society in a different way. And in the case of international education, it's certainly a national issue, but it's also something local, whether it's helping a community understand what the community gains by having foreign students. My family was a host to an AFS student when I was in high school, and what a rich experience that was for the community. But also at a college level, what a difference it makes to have international students in the community, what a difference it makes to have local students study abroad. And I think that learning about that and articulating that, whether one is doing that as a host family or doing that as a local League of Women Voters that wants to have students speaking or wants to support a program for foreign students that with the university or whatever it is, that's one of those things that advocacy at a local level is invaluable. And it's also important at a national level to not just ask the Congress for more money, but to remind the Congress that the legislation needs to articulate why this matters to the country, that we need to have a policy or a philosophical basis for the things that we do, and we need increasingly, I think, to talk about these values. Because one of the reasons I feel we're so challenged in terms of differences, a different point of view these days, is because we've neglected to talk about the values to our society, whether it's the role that immigrants play and the reminder that except for Native Americans, we're all immigrants, we're all standing on ground we don't own. And and that's made our country, I think, richer. And so, but we have to keep having that conversation, because you don't learn that by osmosis. Every generation has to learn that again, and families have to talk about it, and communities need to talk about it, and churches need to talk about it, and we just need to talk about these things more. So, and advocacy is the word that describes those conversations.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. So, as the first female lieutenant governor of Minnesota and then later as the head of NAFSA, can you share, if any, about the relationships you developed with other women leaders on a national level or international level? Thank you.
I can.
And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. One of the stories I share in the book is that the most important mentor I had when I was lieutenant governor was Martha Griffiths. Martha had been a member of Congress from Michigan. If she had stayed in the Congress, she would have been the first female chair of the Appropriations Committee, which is considered the most powerful member of the House. But she left Congress early. I think she served 15 or 20 years because her husband was ill in Detroit, so she went home. And then he got better, and then Jim Blanchard was running for governor in '82, same year we ran, and he needed a running mate who was going to help him, because he felt pretty clear that he needed a competitive advantage. And Martha was a very popular person in Michigan. So he picked Martha, and of course they won. So Martha and I met at the first Lieutenant Governor's Conference in Washington, and within minutes we glommed onto each other, and within hours she learned that I was having such fantastic access to Governor Perpich's meetings, and I had all these specific assignments for the administration. So she decided made it her business to coach me to be ready to be governor. And she did. And it was the most special experience of my life. And one of the things she said to me was, since you've got such good access, don't go anywhere without a notebook, and take notes pay attention to how the governor decides things, and take notes about whether or not you would decide things the same way. And if you would have a different approach, make notes about that. It's not public. It's not your business to share that unless you want to share it with him privately. But the point is, you need to think about how things are what decisions need to be made, and how you would make them if you were the governor. Because the most important job for a lieutenant governor is to be ready to be governor. And then on a periodic basis, make a list of who will be in your cabinet if you're the governor tomorrow. Will you keep the whole team that he's got, or will you keep half of them, and which half will you keep, and who's going to fill in those other gaps? And she said, and keep updating this kind of information in your head every few months. So I did that. And all those journals that I kept are now in the historical archives of the Minnesota Historical Society. They've got a lock on them. You can't read them without my permission. But I think it was a really important exercise for me, and it made me understand clearly that the lack of visibility from the press for a lieutenant governor or a vice president is not really a big problem, because it's not our job to get press. Our job is to be ready to be governor or to be president. And you can't do that in front of the press all the time. You got to do that because you're learning the job. And, for me personally, that was the most exciting part of those 8 years, was how much I learned about state government, and not just about the government itself, but about the state. You travel around and you look at the budgets, and it causes you to think about things that one has never thought about before, especially for me as a small business person. And I'll share one little anecdote about what I learned, just because it's fun. It's in the book. So my first budget conversation, I'm learning so much. There's a whole budget. I won't go into the whole thing in the book, but anyway, one day in this meeting, I'm looking down the list, and there's a line item that says firefighter pension. And I said, I didn't know we had a state firefighting system. And the governor says to Gus Dunhow, the finance commissioner, he said, are you going to tell her or am I? And Gus said, oh, I'll tell her. And he said, so this is a pension for volunteer firefighters, for all the community, because Minnesota is most states are still a volunteer firefighting system in most of the communities. And so this pension is a state pension that is available and based on the hours of service of the volunteers. So they don't get paid, but over time, they get credits on a pension. Well, it's a great idea. I mean, I have nothing against, I'm all for it. But I said to them, are there any women firefighters? And does any woman in Minnesota know about her husband getting this pension? Is this pension something that is listed in a divorce filing? I don't think so. So I said, well, I'm making it my personal business now to every time I give a speech out about in Greater Minnesota, I'm going to talk about the firefighter pension and ask how many people know about it. And for the next 6 years, I never met one woman who knew about it in advance. And at that time, we didn't have any women firefighters out there. There are a few now, but in my hometown, there's one right now, and she's the second one who's ever served as a female firefighter in the volunteer brigade. So.
Oh, okay. Last question. Yeah, that's okay. This can be the last question.
Hi. I just wanted to say, first of all, I have loved everything that you've said. I come from a small town too, and I know that a lot of times it can be very one-minded.
Yes.
And not a lot of outside thoughts. I'm curious, what led you to do such radical, progressive things, like realize that you could do these things that nobody had ever done before?
Well, I think my parents helped a lot. My dad had an 8th grade education. He had been a farmer before the electric co-op movement was created. But in that role, he was creating the electric utility system for rural America was a job of advocacy on a one-on-one basis. They were going farm to farm signing people up. And when my mother worked for him, that's how she met my dad. She was out there farm to farm going with Russell Hegstrom doing more sign-ups. So the mindset of the family was we're out there making the pitch for what needs to happen. That's sort of, we talked about that all the time. And so I think that helped a lot. I think things like 4-H helps a lot because you just get confidence and you make a change. And then, the more, it's like anything else. Some of it is experience that you get without realizing you're getting it. You just keep at it. And failing is miserable at the moment it's happening. Certainly in my case it was, but then you get, in my case, I was able to go to Professor Chuck Green and have him encourage me to get up and fight back to get back into school. And, you find people to help you out at the right moment and just keep at it. And I think, and the issue of writing, I spent 50 years of my life believing I couldn't write. And I didn't let go of that negative feeling until the first 50 pages of this book were written, and I shared them with my friend Pauline Boss, and she said, "You're a good writer." And she was the first person who said those words, who I believed, but it worked because all that negativity left. And for the next year and a half, I wrote this book, enjoying every bloody minute of it, you know. Who would have thought? Because up until then, writing was just something that I just believed deeply. I believed deeply that I could not do it. And now, you know, I still remember last year when I called myself, my editor said to me, Marlene, you kept a journal for all these years, and now you are about to become a published writer, so I would like you to use the word, I am an author. And I still remember when I said it the first time. It was so exciting. And then the second time I said it was at an author meeting that I went to, and I got there early, and I met the author of that event. And she said, and what do you do? And I said, I'm an author. So, you know, you just keep trying these ideas out on yourself, and sometimes they work better than others, and then you try them again. So you'll be great. This is the woman who promoted this event, so she can do anything. You're all here because of her.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks to the library, the School of Journalism, and Dee Dee Long, and all of you for coming. And you'll be available
Absolutely.
at the back.
I'm
yes,
happy to sign books.
Pearl's
I'll go back
Books
in.
is here.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all.